All I wanted was some quiet. After 20 years breathing desert dust and listening to explosions, my ears were begging for peace. That's why I put my savings into this small 10-hectare farm in the Cedar Grove Hills. A place where I could grow my tomatoes, raise a few chickens, and most of all, not have anyone telling me what to do. I was unloading the last moving boxes when a gray-haired man pulled up in his spotless Lexus at the entrance to my property. He was wearing a navy blazer with the golden crest of the Cedar Hills Homeowners Association embroidered on the pocket, as if he were some retired admiral. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. Richard Graves, he introduced himself, handing me a business card that read HOA President in golden letters. I came in person to welcome you and deliver our compliance manual. We take pride in the aesthetic standard of our rural community. I flipped through the 40-page document while he pointed at my old tractor parked in the yard. That vehicle will need to be kept in an enclosed structure. Page 17, Section C. All farm equipment must remain out of sight. You have 30 days to comply. But I bought a farm, not a condo. The broker said this area was free rural development. Richard smiled, his eyes as cold as a predator's when studying its prey. Everyone says that. But Cedar Hills has maintained its standard ever since I founded the association 15 years ago. I can show you where other newbies either got with the program or left the community. Over the next few weeks, I began to understand how Richard's regime worked. First came notices for having my truck about 2 centimeters above the allowed height. Then a fine for parking my truck at the garage entrance for more than 4 hours. Apparently, Richard had cameras watching the neighborhood. The neighbors whispered to me about Richard's background. A former corporate executive who had turned this quiet rural area into his own little kingdom. He controlled the association's elections by rigging the votes of the elderly, who made up 60% of the residents. His fine scheme raked in thousands every month, with no clear accountability. Things got worse when I got my new combine. It wasn't a regular model, it had been modified with special technology. A week later, I found a yellow sticker slapped on it. Aesthetic violation, unauthorized farm equipment, removal in 24 hours. I called Richard immediately. That combine is essential for my farming operation. There's no legal basis to have it removed from my private property. Page 23, Section F, equipment that compromises the visual harmony of the community may be removed after notification. Our committee has already decided. What committee? There's never been a meeting. The executive committee. I am the executive committee. The next day, I was having coffee when I saw a tow truck entering my property, followed by a local police car. Richard was standing next to Officer Johnson, a young man with a rather uneasy look on his face. This is a civil matter, sir, the officer explained. Mr. Graves provided documentation authorizing the removal according to the association's rules. This is trespassing. You have no right. Richard grinned triumphantly as the tow truck hauled my combine. It can be picked up at our depot after you pay the accumulated fines and removal fees. Roughly $5,000. Once they left, I grabbed my encrypted phone from the desk drawer. I had no choice. I dialed the number I never hoped to use here in Cedar Hills. Verification code Delta 9 Echo. Wintergreen rating compromised. Requesting Corvus protocol immediately. The voice on the other end replied calmly, confirmed. Current location? Cedar Hills. And believe me, you won't like where our equipment is right now. 8 hours after my call, a convoy of 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of my house. 4 federal agents in formal attire got out, led by Oliveira, a middle-aged woman with a military bearing I recognized from previous operations overseas. Long time, Marcus, she said, skipping the formalities as soon as we stepped inside. I need a full report, right now. I explained the situation while Oliveira and her team scanned the area for any surveillance devices. One of the techs found 2 microphones hidden in the exterior light fixtures, no doubt a courtesy from Richard. We thought you retired for a quiet life, Oliveira commented. And now we've got a $10 million farm surveillance prototype seized from a condo tyrant. The Wintergreen program depends on that equipment, I explained. The remote sensing technology disguised in an ordinary combine is our best cover for monitoring substance trafficking in border crops. We were testing its range across different terrains. Oliveira checked her tablet. Our records show that you acquired this property legally, without any binding HOA restrictions. The GPS coordinates confirm it's outside the original association boundaries. How did this Richard guy manage to annex your property? That's the issue. He seems to manipulate documents and records at will. Several neighbors have told me similar stories. One of the agents, a legal expert, interjected, territorial annexations without the explicit consent of the owners are illegal in this state. We need access to the association's records. No way, I replied. Richard keeps everything in his private office. Not even the board members have access. A neighbor tried to sue 2 years ago, and mysteriously, all the documents disappeared from the local courthouse. Oliveira closed her tablet with determination. This goes beyond equipment recovery. We have federal jurisdiction when there's interference in national security operations. We're heading to the depot now. We arrived at the depot, actually, a private shed at the back of Richard's property. A burly man with a security badge tried to stop us, but he backed off when Oliveira flashed her federal badge. What we found was shocking. Not only was my combine parked there, but there were also dozens of vehicles, tractors, garden equipment, and even patio furniture confiscated from other residents. Everything was meticulously catalogued with labels detailing violations and absurd fines. This isn't a homeowners association, it's an extortion operation, one of the agents noted as he photographed everything. Richard's phone rang 15 times before he answered. I could hear panic in his voice when Oliveira identified herself and demanded his immediate presence. Richard arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by Officer Johnson and a man who introduced himself as the association's lawyer. His face went pale when he saw the federal agents cataloguing his depot. This is private property. You don't have a warrant. Richard protested, his commanding tone quickly replaced by nervousness. Oliveira approached him, imposing in her immaculate suit. Mr. Graves, we're investigating interference in classified federal operations, misappropriation of government equipment, and possible systematic fraud. We don't need a warrant when there's evidence of an ongoing federal crime. The lawyer tried to interrupt. My client acted within the legal prerogatives of the homeowners association. Any dispute should be settled in civil court. Your client illegally seized government surveillance equipment classified as secret, Oliveira shot back. And he's apparently been running an illegal seizure scheme for years. The Department of Justice has a specific interest in associations that overstep their legal bounds to extort residents. Richard, visibly shaken, tried to regain his composure. It's all a misunderstanding. I was just following the statutes that were democratically approved by the community. Interesting, one of the agents said as he handled a folder found in the shed's office. Because we just found 5 different versions of these democratically approved statutes, each with different dates and suspiciously similar signatures. Officer Johnson discreetly moved away from Richard. I just responded to civil disturbance calls. I've never been directly involved in any seizures. Oliveira ignored his attempt to absolve himself. Mr. Graves, you're under arrest for questioning. Officer Johnson, you'll also need to come with us for further clarification. As the agents escorted Richard out, he shot me a look of pure hatred. You don't know who you're dealing with. I have connections in the state government, in the judiciary. That only made Oliveira smile. Perfect. We love it when the scheme is bigger than it initially appears. In the following days, the investigation spread like wildfire. Agents knocked on every door in Cedar Hills, gathering testimony from dozens of residents who finally felt safe enough to talk about years of abuse. An elderly couple revealed they had paid over $30,000 in fines over the past 5 years for violations like having planters in the wrong color or curtains that didn't match the approved standard. A 78-year-old widow tearfully admitted that Richard had threatened to foreclose on her house for late payments on fees she didn't even know existed. The association's financial records, seized from Richard's personal office, revealed a maze of offshore accounts and suspicious transactions. Preliminary audits estimated misappropriations of over $2 million over 15 years, money that was supposed to have gone into community improvements. He falsified nearly everything, Oliveira explained when she came back to update me. The association's territorial boundaries were illegally expanded 7 times, annexing properties without consent. The annual elections never happened, he rigged the results. The seizure scheme generated extra income. After confiscating the assets, he waited a few months and then sold them to third parties as abandoned. The story got even darker when they discovered an agreement between Richard and a local construction company. He systematically pressured elderly homeowners to sell their houses at below-market values, using exorbitant fines as a coercive tool. The properties were then resold for a profit, with Richard pocketing undeclared commissions. A week after the initial arrest, I was called in for a formal statement. The temporary office the FBI had set up at the town hall was packed with documents, computers, and physical evidence. Oliveira greeted me with an expression that was part satisfaction and part astonishment. "Your little neighborhood problem has just triggered one of the biggest community fraud investigations I've ever seen," she commented. Richard had the perfect scheme. Small enough to fly under the radar, isolated enough to prevent organized complaints. But seizing that combine was his fatal mistake. I sat down for the formal statement, recounting every interaction with Richard in precise detail. When I finished, Oliveira showed me a confidential file. Richard Graves isn't his real name. He's actually Ronald Grimshaw, a former corporate executive indicted for fraud in 2005 in 3 different states. He disappeared before his trial and apparently rebuilt his life here, creating this little extortion empire. And what about the local authorities? Officer Johnson clearly knew what was going on. Corrupt to the core. He was receiving monthly payments to provide legal cover for the seizures. The county sheriff is fully cooperating. Apparently he had suspected it for years, but never managed to gather concrete proof. 2 agents walked into the room, interrupting our conversation. "Sorry for the interruption, but the federal judge just signed the expanded warrants. We now have authorization to access all the accounts and properties." Oliveira stood up, getting ready to leave. Richard, or rather, Ronald, is trying to negotiate a plea deal. He's offering up the names of public officials who took bribes over the years to validate his operations. Is he really going to rat out all his connections? When we showed him the evidence of interference in national security operations, he understood the gravity of the situation. We're talking about potentially decades behind bars. It's extraordinary how people who terrorize entire communities crumble quickly when faced with real consequences. I left the FBI's makeshift office and walked down the main street of Cedar Hills. Several neighbors waved, now openly friendly without fear of retaliation. Dorothy, an 82-year-old lady who lived 2 houses down from mine, was taking down a standardized white fence she hated, but which Richard had mandated she install. 15 years, she commented when I stopped to help her. 15 years living in fear of fines and threats over things as trivial as the color of my flowers. It seems like we can finally breathe again. As we pulled out the last stakes of the fence, I thought about the irony. I came to Cedar Hills looking for peace after years of conflict, only to find myself at the center of a different kind of battle. But unlike the wars I knew, this one had finally ended, not with more destruction, but with the promise of rebuilding. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, the residents of Cedar Hills were called to a community meeting in the small hall of the local church. Unlike previous HOA meetings, there were no chairs arranged in military rows or strictly controlled microphones. The residents arrived hesitantly, like animals newly freed from a long captivity, unsure of how to act in their newfound freedom. Jennifer Ramirez, a 67-year-old retired teacher who had lived in the community since its founding, took the initiative to coordinate the meeting. For the first time in 15 years, she began, her voice growing stronger with every word. "We're gathering without fear of retaliation, arbitrary fines, or intimidation. federal investigations have confirmed what many of us suspected: our homeowners association was operating illegally, with forged statutes and fraudulent elections. A murmur spread through the hall. For some, especially the older ones, the situation still seemed unreal. Richard had created such an oppressive atmosphere that many doubted their own grasp on reality. The federal agents informed us that we have two options, Jennifer continued. We can elect a new administrative board for the existing association, with legal oversight for the first few years, or we can vote to completely dissolve the HOA. Frank Miller, a 75-year-old veteran who had lost half his retirement savings to fines over the past 10 years, got up with difficulty. Why would we even need an association? We were perfectly fine before this nightmare started. The comment sparked a wave of approval. Years of pent-up resentment were coming to the surface. I bought my house for peace in my old age, declared Dorothy, now wearing a colorful gardening hat that Richard would have fined instantly. Not to have someone measuring the height of my grass with a ruler every week. A volunteer lawyer, sent by the State Civil Rights Association, explained the legal procedures for dissolution. You'd need 75% of the votes from registered owners. We also have to consider practical aspects, like the maintenance of common areas and roads. I was surprised when several eyes turned to me. Apparently, my role in taking down Richard had turned me into an inadvertent local hero. I'm not an expert in community governance, I clarified. I came here looking for privacy and autonomy, just like many of you. But maybe we can build something different, a voluntary system where we only cooperate when needed without any oppressive rules. In the weeks that followed, we turned that initial meeting into regular planning sessions. With each meeting, more residents showed up, bringing ideas and sharing abuse stories they'd never dared to tell before. A sense of genuine community started to blossom, ironically, something the Homeowners Association was meant to promote, but only emerged after it collapsed. We discovered that many of the common areas Richard claimed to manage were actually abandoned properties he had illegally annexed to the HOA. Others were public easements that already had municipal maintenance, for which Richard was charging duplicate fees. With the help of volunteer lawyers, we drafted a proposal for the formal dissolution of the association and the creation of an advisory community committee with no coercive powers. The model would be based on voluntary participation, complete transparency, and consensus-based decisions. Voting day arrived on a sunny Saturday morning. The turnout was impressive. 98% of the owners showed up, including some who traveled hundreds of miles just to witness the end of the regime that had tormented them for so long. The result was overwhelming. 94% voted for the complete dissolution of the HOA. When Jennifer announced the numbers, a reverent silence filled the hall, followed by applause that turned into tears of relief for many. "I'm free to paint my door any color I want," whispered a lady next to me, as if uttering sacred words. That night, spontaneously, the residents organized a community barbecue, something strictly forbidden under Richard's rules. Tables lined the main street, decorated with tablecloths of various colors and patterns. Children ran freely among the unfenced gardens, and for the first time I noticed just how many young families actually lived in the community, previously too intimidated to socialize openly. The physical transformation of Cedar Hills over the following months was remarkable. Gardens bloomed with bursts of creativity. Some opted for perfectly organized designs, others went for natural, wild looks. The diversity that emerged perfectly reflected the personalities of owners who had once been suppressed. We established a simple coordination system for practical matters, a voluntary email list for communications, informal monthly meetings in the community garden we set up on the abandoned lot behind the church, and a voluntary fund for specific projects with transparent accounting. The dissolution of the HOA had another unexpected effect: property values increased. Without exorbitant fees and arbitrary restrictions, Cedar Hills became a desirable destination for families seeking a genuine rural lifestyle with a sense of community. "What happened here is extraordinary," commented a reporter from a regional newspaper who came to cover our transformation. "You not only got rid of an oppressive regime, but you've created an alternative model that other communities are interested in studying." On a particularly pleasant autumn afternoon, while I was working in my now expanded garden, I saw Dorothy walking along what used to be called Richard's inspection route, the path he used to patrol every week in search of violations to fine. "I'm reorganizing my garden," she announced cheerfully. "I've always dreamed of planting a small orchard, but Richard insisted that fruit trees attracted unwanted pests. Could you help me with some saplings?" That afternoon, a group of 5 neighbors spontaneously gathered to help Dorothy prepare the soil for her new orchard. We worked until dusk, sharing stories and knowledge. Frank brought his old tractor, previously hidden in a shed to avoid fines, and it made the work a whole lot easier. Olivera still visited occasionally, keeping an eye on how the case against Richard had expanded to include corrupt officials in 3 neighboring counties. During her last visit, we looked out together at the revitalized community from my porch. "You know what's fascinating?" she commented. "Richard thought he was building an empire, but he was actually creating the conditions for a community revolution. People would have never come together like this without a common enemy. It's almost tempting to thank him," I joked, serving lemonade in colorful cups that would have been considered aesthetically discordant under the old regime. "The investigators found a pattern," Olivera continued. "Richard, or rather Ronald, did this in at least 3 other communities before. He settled in transitional rural areas, manipulated the formation of HOAs, and gradually turned them into extortion machines. And no one noticed for so long? He carefully picked his victims. Isolated communities, lots of elderly residents, and few external connections. The perverse genius was in the scale, small enough to avoid federal attention, large enough to generate substantial profits. When Olivera left, I walked out to the field where my combine now operated freely. The equipment kept gathering data for the agency, but with the residents' explicit blessing, since they appreciated the extra security that the surveillance technology provided in the border region. In a way, I still hadn't found exactly the peace I was looking for when I moved to Cedar Hills. Instead of the quiet isolation I had imagined, I found myself at the center of a vibrant, interconnected community. I regularly took part in Sunday potluck dinners, helped out with the elderly neighbors' gardening projects, and even coordinated an informal mentoring program for local teens interested in modern farming. The irony wasn't lost on me. I came to this small farm to escape the rigid, hierarchical structure of military life, only to inadvertently become a community leader. The crucial difference, though, was that here leadership didn't mean control or imposition, it was collaborative, voluntary, and based on mutual respect. On a quiet morning, while harvesting the season's first tomatoes, I got a message on my cell phone. It was a photo sent by Olivera, Richard Graves, now officially recognized as Ronald Grimshaw, receiving his final sentence, 28 years in federal prison for fraud, extortion, document forgery, and obstruction of governmental operations. I looked at the photo of the man who had caused so much terror, now diminished in his orange prison uniform. I felt no joy or vengeance, just a strange sense of closure. Olivera's message simply read, "Justice finally served. Your combine was the perfect catalyst." I put down my phone and went back to my garden. The fences that once strictly marked the property boundaries had been removed in many places, creating a natural flow between spaces. On the horizon, the fields rolled with diverse crops, not standardized by the arbitrary aesthetic of a tyrant, but expressing the true essence of the American countryside: freedom, diversity, and voluntary interdependence. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get more stories like this. Cedar Hills had transformed. It was no longer a community defined by fear and conformity, but a true home where people looked out for each other by choice, not by imposition. For someone who spent his life following orders and then seeking isolation, I discovered a third alternative I had never considered: a community where individual autonomy and collective cooperation not only coexist but mutually reinforce each other.